This one a little later date. The figures seem to be sort of small in stature, like the doll-like. We will see this used as a sculpture device in later Christian art, where the head gets too large for the body, and the body becomes sort of shortened. Slide, please. Slide, please. And another art form that we will return to, we have seen a little bit in the architecture, was the use of mosaics. Now, the true use of mosaics, of the glass things, did not come into use until the Byzantine period, about the 5th century A.D. But the Romans used partly glass, but mostly natural colored stones to create their mosaics. And these were used not only as wall decorations, but architectural decorations and floor patterns. Slide, please. And probably one of the most famous that shows you bikinis were not invented in the 20th century. But these are actually called, they were bathing girls, and these were bathing suits that they wore. It was thought that they might have been in some athletic event. Slide, please. And of course, many of the fights of the gladiators and the Colosseums were recorded in not only frescoes, but in this one in mosaic. Slide, please. Slide, please. It obviously seems that in the portrayal that they did do away with some of the gladiators, the fighting to death. Slide, please. For the review, before our test, Egyptian, architecture, post and lintel, fairly rectangular, the step pyramid. Slide, please. In their sculpture, traditional forms carried out 3,000 years. Block forms with the massive stone sculpture. Slide, please. And the wall painting, flat, very outlined, linear patterns against a flat background. Slide, please. Mesopotamian architecture, the massive use of sort of grotesque animals, and also the grotesque animals displayed in relief ceramic bricks that had a high glaze surface to them. Slide, please. In their sculpture, from the Sumerians to the Assyrians, it was a presentation of idols to the commemorative battles of the kings. Slide, please. Then the Aegean culture, we have in their architecture not very much at all, but possibly the palace at Minos, the Mycenaean king, King Minos, where it's really no distinguishing characteristics to the architecture except that their columns were sort of wood with the mushroom caps to them. Slide, please. From the early Aegean, the Cyclades Islands, you have in their sculpture, the sort of geometric idol forms. Slide, please. And in their vase painting, a free overall pattern design, very loosely brushed on. Sometimes using geometric, most of the later ones using animal forms. Slide, please. In the archaic Greek work, in the earliest pottery, we have complete geometric designs first, and then just slight indications of the figures within the bands. Slide, please. In their sculpture, you have a very stylized, stiff presentation of the human form. Slide, please. Greek architecture, the Doric, Ionic, mostly, and some very little Corinthian, but again, only post and lintel form of construction. Slide, please. In the classic Greek sculpture, you have the figure completely at ease in space, complete technical knowledge of placing this figure within space. Slide, please. The Etruscans were a happy group, decorated their tombs with lively wall paintings, sort of a fast linear pattern with designs, nice rich earth tones, but usually depicted some event or interest of the person buried there. Slide, please. The Etruscans also did some sculpture, but mostly in terracotta, in clay, whereas the Greeks used stone. Slide, please. The Romans were great ones for building. They not only took ideas from all cultures, but then they instigated the arch principle, which spanned greater areas. Whereas the Greeks were always rectilinear in their design, the Romans, breaking across with this arch principle, were able to free greater spaces. The Corinthian column was by far the favorite of the Roman architect. Slide, please. Clear. May I have your attention, please? This tape is on early Christian art. Put in the first slide, please. The cultures that we have studied so far in this series have formed their art to follow certain functions. With their architecture, it was controlled geographically and with the materials that they had at hand. With their decoration, it was for a certain purpose. Either, most of them to this time, has been a religious purpose, but other than that, for decoration of tombs, of homes, etc. And with the decorative arts and the sculpture was also fitting this purpose. We have gone through now all of the pagan cultures, and now as we change from AD to BC, from BC to AD, and after the rise of Christianity, we have a new form of art, and it also was dictated by religion and the belief in Christianity. BC art, of course, expresses no Christian beliefs. So the art from now on will be easily identifiable as to either pagan or Christian. The forms itself, of course, carries through, because one culture, as it grows into another, will influence the new culture in its forms that it takes to express its ideas and beliefs. The early Christian religion, using a modern-day term, was an underground affair, but this was literal. With pagan Rome in its decline in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, the Christian religion spread from Constantinople, from the birthplace of Christianity, from Jerusalem, over to the Italian peninsula. Now you must remember at this point too, in Roman history, that the Roman Empire had spread far and wide over Spain, the continent of Europe, even to England, and certainly setting up almost a dual empire with two capitals, one in Rome and one in Constantinople, and that one being influenced much more by the Eastern influence or the Asian influence of art. This then spread back to the peninsula, and these forms were established in the art of the early Christian. It was not a decorative art, it was sort of an emotional outpouring of untrained artists expressing an idea or a belief. The art form was not art for art's sake at this point. It was to express this idea of Christianity, and through visual interpretations were able to spread the word. Now, as I said, the religion was underground. You have heard the term catacombs, and these were the burial places of the early Christians. These were also the meeting places, and it wasn't until the 300s, with the age of Constantine, that the religion was legalized, that it could be performed above ground or out in the open. We've certainly heard of the punishment of the Christians in the Roman arenas and through the martyrdom of the early saints. The art forms then take the same forms as the early tombs of, say, the Etruscans that were buried underground. But this time we see the representation of the Christian symbols and of the religious figures of the Christian religion. This early 1st century fresco, one of the first of the early Christian frescoes found in catacombs, usually around Rome, depicts the figure of Christ. The painter who did this fresco was quite knowledgeable of freedom of movement in the brushstrokes. As the centuries progressed, and there was no formal training for these artists who depicted these scenes, the classical interpretation or the formalized education of these artists slips away, and you have untrained people depicting these stories. In no way does this lessen the beauty of its art, but we have a more naive presentation. Slide, please. These catacombs were carved in sort of cave-like exteriors, just like mines would be carved into the underground systems today. Not all of these were decorated. A lot of these were a combination of pagan and Christian burial places, because there was this very slight transition in the changeover from the pagan religions to the Christian religions. In this one, an alcove with some decoration, a fairly elaborate tomb, where they even carved in pilaster columns with capitals, and then the surfaces were decorated with favorite biblical stories. This one, Daniel and the lion's den. Slide, please. And we see a closer presentation. This is a far cry in the ideal figure of, say, the Greeks and then the more realistic Roman copies. The spirit of the story is by far more important. The technique is just adequate fresco painting. Slide, please. This is also a section of an underground catacomb. We will see some later on that in building the Roman subway near the Via Veneto today, they have come upon a very important Christian catacomb that heretofore had been undiscovered. Slide, please. The forms are fairly traditional. You're using the earth pigments, so you will still have the same sort of black, rust, brown tones that you will find in most any of the early primitive frescoes. The conditions of these, since they were really not cared for, are in a sad state of affairs. Slide, please. There were also Christian houses. Of course, the religion was illegal at the time, so these had to be done in secrecy. But in fairly wealthy homes where these Roman people were changing over to the idea of Christianity, they would decorate their homes, and this is a portion of one that has been rebuilt in an art gallery, most of the fragments in place, and it was the baptismal area. Some of them would have private altars where the services could be held. Most of the larger gatherings, though, were underground in large cavernous areas of the catacombs. All underneath Rome, there's these series of long little passages with little burial crypts alongside of them, and then eventually ending up in a large area where they could gather for the services and ceremonies. Slide, please. A very poor relief, but of one of the Christian houses. Slide, please. The main source of identification, of course, is in the subject matter. It seems that as the centuries grew on, and the artists, untrained as they were, expressing the ideas, that some of the quality is quite divided some quite competently done, some very crudely done. But in the whole effect, the figure grows shorter. The head gets a little large for the body. This is a more or less primitive notion of where the head is the most important part of the person. This is how you communicate with the person. As in little children's art, they will start first with the head, and then as they grow older, add the body. In early Christian art, the head became important, and the figures became sort of slight. Slide, please. A series from the Last Supper. Slide, please. The forms are still basically based on the Greek or Roman paintings of the period, because this is all that they had to go by, except the story is, of course, much different. Christ with the animals. Slide, please. Another very important form of early Christian art is in the sarcophagi, or the tombs, the coffins of the people. Many of these combine pagan stories, mythology, along with Christian stories, early biblical tales. These are carved in relief in stone. The body was placed within the sarcophagus, and according to the wealth of the person, the more elaborate the sarcophagi became. As you can see here, they're still basing, of course this was the normal dress of the period, still the toga. Some had war implements or armor according to the position of the person. And the figure is based really like on little renditions of Roman copies of the Greek ideal. You still have the drape, but then look how squat the figure is becoming. A compact, sort of massive, muscular type thing, except the head is much too large for the body, and in this one the hand is even overly large for the figure. Slide, please. The different stories of the Bible were quite popular, and one of the most popular was Jonah falling into the and being swallowed up by the whale. And on this sarcophagi, it shows the story of Jonah and the whale. As with most primitive things, the overall pattern becomes very important. Think back to the Mesopotamian period. This is carved in much deeper relief than the Mesopotamian art. Slide, please. And then this is Jonah being saved from the mouth of the whale over on the far right. Nice sort of interpretation of the waves, and the boat sort of sitting nicely, but very similar to the victory columns of the Roman armies, in more or less the same manner. A very realistic interpretation, and yet the way it's all pieced together makes for sort of a stylized presentation. Slide, please. This is another fresco. It's a black and white photograph, but it shows them building a mausoleum. Slide, please. The Saints Peter and Paul. All of the religion was carried on in the catacombs. There were no buildings or no architecture above ground, and it was not until the 4th century that we have some of the very first churches. Slide, please. Many of these things in form, the sort of linear pattern, are strongly influenced by the Byzantine style that we will study in the next lecture. And this style of the Eastern or the Asian influence greatly influenced the early church architecture and paintings of the 5th and 6th centuries AD. Slide, please. Now within this you see the Last Supper area, and then that large dark area that's cut into the wall was the burial vault. The person then was laid out in this, and then it was covered up, and then the fresco would be painted over the entire surface. These are usually fairly, not completely solid rock. It was done more in dirt in the mud area, but the surface was then packed very, very hard, supported with some architectural elements, and then covered over with this plaster to form a smooth surface to work on. Slide, please. Again, Jonah being saved from the whale. These great stories of sort of dramatic intent were popular with the people. Slide, please. Slide, please. This certainly shows the Byzantine influence that we'll see in the decoration of the eyes. Now, this in no way is influenced by Roman or Greek art. This highly stylized eyes goes back to early Asian paintings, even the Persian paintings, where the line quality becomes very important. Slide, please. Slide, please. Fresco of Adam and Eve. It's sort of a naive approach to it. Slide, please. There is actually very little free sculpture of the early Christian period. This one, of the Good Shepherd, is of the 3rd century A.D. Now we could compare this to the early calf bearer of the archaic Greek period. How simple the archaic calf bearer was in comparison to this sort of strained, overworked, highly detailed piece of work. This is only about 3 feet high, which is quite large for early Christian sculpture. Most of it is just fragmentary and usually decorative or useful objects. It is based on the Roman ideal, except the figure becomes very squatty. There is some indication of muscle structure, but again, the figure is starting to lack movement. What the figure looks like becomes more important than the action of the figure. Slide, please. Getting back to some sarcophagus sculpture, this one is of the Christ figure. It's sort of ideal to show the interpretation of the muscle structure of the 3rd and 4th century sculpture of the early Christian ideal of man. It is more or less based on the classic figure, except pushed down to almost doll-like size. Most of these figures were worked within a squared-off architectural framework where they were little like vignettes or little boxes that these little scenes could be portrayed in. The chest area was sort of emphasized where the heart or the soul would be, as they thought. And the arms are quite stocky and muscular. The head, again, extremely large for the body. Slide, please. Now, we have the mixture of the Christ symbol in the last one with a very pagan mythology figures on the same sarcophagus. Sometimes they were interchangeable. Possibly it is thought that the people whose sarcophagus it was to be for accepted the Christian religion at a very late date in their lifetime and had some of the motifs changed on their coffins. Slide, please. Again, the Good Shepherd. Slide, please. In being able to see a complete sarcophagus, you can see how elaborate some of them got. The daughter of Constantine, one of the last of the Roman emperors, had a magnificent sarcophagus carved out of a blood-red garnet stone with very subtle decorations. Now in this one you have more of a feeling of a frieze, of where the entire surface is composed as one unit on each side. More often, the side panels were broken into segments of where they could produce the little different scenes that would either tell a continuing story or different stories of the Bible. As in most of the primitive art, except that this has a spirit to it. This was sort of an emotional thing of where the proportions of the figure were not important. It's what the story told that was by far the most important aspect of early Christian art. They still used some of the pagan forms, also some of the Roman type decoration, and within the border design, where you have neat, precise feeling in the classic interpretation, you have a more freewheeling pattern of design, like they just started at one end, thought of a design that continued, and whether it was completely regular or not did not seem to be important. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Another one where it's divided into two bands, sort of like two friezes, running around the base of the sarcophagus. Slide, please. There was one, it's called, or titled today, The Sarcophagus of the Two Brothers. And they're depicted as in portraiture on the end. Now these have some feeling of an individual character, and yet just the lack of technique or the lack of knowledge in handling stone that had been lost by this time, because the teachings had been broken, because most of this had to be done in secret. But you have sort of a naive, untrained approach to portraiture in this sarcophagus. Also from the tomb of the two brothers. This is very deep in relief, almost some of the figures standing three-dimensionally away from the side. Slide, please. Slide, please. Even though the technique might not be perfected, the intricacy of the design certainly didn't stop them, because these are quite elaborate. Slide, please. Slide, please. This is a beautiful example of where they use the Corinthian column and little arches of where the different things are segmented. And we'll see some of the close-ups, like the second from the bottom on the left is of Adam and Eve. The middle one is the flight into Egypt. The one above it, directly in the center, is Christ teaching in the temple. But they're beautiful little figures that are set within these niches. And this follows through much later, and even up to Renaissance art, of where the storyline would be much like our comic pages today, little blocks of the story that a person could enter and just sort of look around it, and without anybody telling them the story, get the idea of the storyline. Slide, please. But these are beautifully carved, a great amount of delicacy to it. The person who designed this designed a very elaborate scheme for this, and yet, even if they have this amount of technical knowledge of how to attack a problem of depth in bas-relief sculpture, they still are not interested in perfecting the ideal proportions of the figures as the Greeks or the Romans would be. Slide, please. This form of the Adam and Eve with the tree in between and the snake crawling up the tree will be used constantly throughout art, way past the Renaissance period. Slide, please. This is a beautiful little reliquary box. Now, the reliquary boxes we will see used on through. This one's carved of wood, and then later on they become even a little more precious, and they're carved of ivory. And then in the late Gothic period, they're cast in bronze or gold and then filled in with beautiful enamels and jewels. These little reliquary boxes, and you can see by the size of the latch there, this is approximately 15 to 20 inches in dimension, held relics of different saints, either bones or pieces of cloth or fragment, but of some memento of that saint. Now these were done with beautiful precision and care because they were on a very tiny, delicate scale. Slide, please. The relief is usually much lower in these pieces than on the sarcophagi. Slide, please. And it usually told the life of the saint of whatever relic was inside. Slide, please. Slide, please. This is a little later catacomb, but all of them were based on the same principle. The Christian art did not change from the 1st century to about the 3rd or 4th century when it was allowed to become legalized and accepted as a religion. They just, as in the Egyptian art of the tombs, just followed the same forms as had been done in the previous centuries. Slide, please. Christ separating the seas. Slide, please. The raising of Lazarus. And again, the dark area was the actual burial place. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. And every once in a while they would throw in some mythology. Slide, please. Slide, please. These last few slides are from the sections of the tomb recently found under the Via Veneto. Slide. Slide. And very late forms of the bas-relief sculpture. The form did not change, as I said, for about 200 or 300 years. It continued more or less along the same line. Technical ability remaining about average. Slide, please. This is the sarcophagus carved for the daughter of Constantine. Constantina was her name. It is a beautiful example of sort of a delicate, graceful patterning on this dark red stone. Slide, please. Very late sarcophagus. Slide, please. Even in the Arch of Constantine, which we would consider Roman next to the Colosseum in Rome, from pagan symbols that decorate the upper section of it, more religious or Christian symbols or scenes decorate the other areas of the arch. So it's really a combination of both the early Roman or pagan with the Christian religion. Slide, please. There's actually very little architecture that we would consider early Christian period. Now with the architecture, when they came out of the catacombs and they decided they had to establish some sort of a building for their religion, it was most natural for them to go back to the Greek-style temple that had been duplicated in Rome, of course, as we've seen some of the temple structures in the Forum in Rome. This would be a square box type barn, but in this instance, because it had to include the people within the interior and the altar end where the ceremony would take place would dominate the whole feature of the church, they had to work in a pattern of traffic movement that came around, and because most of the times a relic of a certain saint would be embedded in the altar, it was also sort of a shrine type affair. This is the Church of the Nazareth in Jerusalem, one of the very earliest basic features. And this shows a little of the influence of not the pure rectangular type church that you would find on the Italian peninsula, but it has these sort of little bloops of decoration coming out the back end of where the people had to go around the altar. It had to be an open area for them to circulate around and then back out the front of the church. Slide, please. There were two forms, actually. The rectangular church, the box-like, barn-like appearance of the Greek temples, the floor plan, and also one that was more popular in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and this came from a circular form of church. This was developed then later on in the Byzantine architecture, where these are done about 4th century. There is almost no transition between calling it early Christian and Byzantine. One just slightly flows right into another. Slide, please. The exterior of one of the Byzantine type churches would be the sort of octagonal or round type feature with these little extra added alcoves that stick around from the outside. But basically it's a circular drum with a domed roof over it. Slide, please. The other type would be this long barn-like structure, usually with a wood roof, so this is basically why we don't have too many of them left today. But this was a drawing, a later drawing of St. Paul's without the walls, or outside the walls. And you would have the two side aisles for the people to walk around, and then the central nave, nave, coming from the Latin word to navigate or to cross over, so that you have from the entrance sort of a transition of the person walking in to the altar. Slide, please. Many of the early churches used these symbolic effects, not only in the plan of the church, but also within their decoration, where symbols became very important, like the peacock became a symbol of eternity, the dove became the symbol of the Holy Trinity, the lambs became the symbol of the flock of the Lord. So you have all of these used within their decoration. Even the name of the nave of the church comes from this transition thing of to navigate, to cross over. So from the entrance you cross through the nave to the altar. Slide, please. They became fairly elaborate in the Byzantine churches. You have the circular drum, and then to allow for this movement of passage around, you have this outer ring called an ambulatory. You amble along, and this sort of circulated the people around the church. The exterior of the early churches was very crude, very rough. The brick left showing, rough tiled roofs. A very humble sort of an exterior. And then as the churches became more elaborate and more beautifully decorated in the interior, it became almost as if you were entering the heavens. They wanted you to have the feeling that you come from this very earthy, humble existence on the outside, and then you enter the world of God. Slide, please. This is really sort of bordering on the lecture for next week, where we will study Byzantine architecture and decoration. Basically, I'm showing you these to show you the very beginnings in the early forms of the Christian architecture. With early Christian art, though, you basically have two forms that identify it: the wall paintings or frescoes of the tombs and the carvings on the sarcophagi. There is so little architecture of the early Christian period that you can almost only identify it by floor plans. There's no existing or remaining complete structures of that period. Slide, please. The ambulatory. Slide, please. And then bringing in the Eastern influence that we will see next week in the most beautiful of church decorations are the mosaics of the Byzantine period. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Clear the machine.